My name is Amir, and I am 62 years old. And it was me. It was my hand that held the hammer. I was the one who walked into the quiet sanctity of the old downtown cathedral, my heart a cold, hard knot of fury in my chest, and shattered the sacred silence. The hammer was hidden beneath my coat, its dense weight a perfect match for the rage that had been building inside me for years. My objective was singular, a burning point of light in the darkness of my mind, to obliterate the face of the marble Madonna. To me, she wasn't a figure of grace. She was an idol of stone and paint, a poison that was seeping into the soul of my daughter, Layla, pulling her away from the path I had laid out for her, the path of our ancestors, the path of righteousness. It had all started with a small, glinting piece of silver, a cross necklace. A gift from a boy at her school. When I saw it resting against her skin, something inside me broke. A fanaticism I didn't know I possessed burned through my veins, a hot whisper that told me I had to do something, that I had to act. It's hard to look back on the man I was. It feels like watching a stranger, someone possessed by a spirit of pride and fear. But that stranger was me. If you're finding a connection with this story, if some part of it is already speaking to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It helps more than you know. And I'd truly love to hear where you're watching from, so please, leave a comment below with your city or country. Let me know I'm not alone in this. My life here, in this country, always felt like a quiet war. We came here for a better future, for Layla. But I watched as my family slowly dissolved into a culture that was not our own. Our traditions felt like they were fading, like old photographs left out in the sun. Our neighbors, a kind man named Pastor Dave and his wife, were the embodiment of everything I had come to resent. They would have these Sunday potlucks, the air filled with the smell of grilled meat and the sound of songs I didn't understand. They spoke of grace, of a faith that felt easy. Too easy. It was a faith of symbols and songs that felt hollow to me, a world away from the disciplined, structured faith I had been raised in. Back at my own place of worship, I would listen to our Imam, Hassan, a good man who preached about finding common ground, about love and understanding between peoples. But I was deaf to that message. I only heard the parts that validated my own zeal, the warnings against straying from the path, the calls for purity. I twisted his words to build the walls around my heart even higher. In my mind, destroying that statue wasn't an act of desecration. It was an act of purification, a desperate, violent attempt to protect what little was left of my world, to save my daughter from what I saw as a creeping corruption. I truly believed I was doing a righteous thing. I can remember that afternoon as if it were yesterday. The cathedral was hushed, the air thick with the scent of old wood, melting wax, and something else, something ancient and still. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floors in jewels of red and blue and gold. Tourists whispered in small groups, their cameras clicking softly. A few elderly women knelt in the pews, their heads bowed, their fingers tracing the beads of their rosaries. They were all part of a world I couldn't enter, a peace I couldn't comprehend. My own peace was in the cold, hard certainty of the hammer under my coat. My heart was a war drum, hammering against my ribs, a frantic, violent rhythm against their quiet devotion. I walked past them, my eyes fixed on the side chapel where she stood. The Madonna. She was carved from a single piece of white marble, her expression serene, her hands held open in a gesture of welcome. To everyone else, she was a symbol of love. To me, she was the enemy. I reached the low velvet rope that cordoned off the chapel. I stepped over it. I heard a woman let out a sharp, sudden gasp, a sound like a bird taking flight. I ignored it. I ignored them all. There was only me, the statue, and the righteous fire in my blood. I pulled the hammer from my coat. Its polished head gleamed in the colored light. I raised my arm, drawing on every ounce of my fear, my anger, my grief. and I brought all of my fury down on the protective glass that stood between me and her. The sound was a shockwave, not just a crack but an explosion. The glass didn't just break, it detonated, flying outward in 1,000 glittering shards, like a universe of shattered tears. For a moment, there was a dead silence. The gasps had stopped. The whispers had died. All that was left was the echo of my violence hanging in the holy air. The echo faded. The universe of shattered glass lay glittering on the marble floor, and a new sound rushed in to fill the void. It wasn't divine judgment. It wasn't the sound of a corrupt idol crumbling into dust. It was the sound of human fear. A woman screamed, a high, piercing shriek that sliced through the sacred air. A child, startled by the explosion, began to cry, a wail that seemed to accuse me personally. The whispers turned to shouts, a chorus of alarm and confusion. I stood there for a heartbeat, the hammer still raised, my arm tensed for the second blow, the one that would strike the serene face of the statue itself. I had expected to feel a surge of power, of righteous victory. I was a warrior for the true path, a soldier of my God, cleansing the world of a false image. But what I felt was nothing, just a dull ringing in my ears and the sudden chilling awareness of dozens of eyes on me, not eyes of awe or of fear for my righteous power, but of horror and pity. 2 men in dark blue uniforms, the cathedral's security guards, were running towards me, their faces grim, their hands reaching for their sides. The moment was over. My grand gesture, my act of purification, had ended not with a thunderclap from heaven, but with the frantic, clumsy rush of mortal men. The fire in my veins had been extinguished, replaced by a strange, cold calm. The hammer, which had felt like an extension of my own will just moments before, now felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight of shame. It slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor with a hollow, metallic clang that seemed to echo my own sudden emptiness. They didn't have to struggle with me. I offered no resistance as they twisted my arms behind my back, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking shut around my wrists, the sound sharp and final. As they led me away, down the center aisle, past the shocked faces of the tourists and the weeping old women who clutched their rosaries, I caught one last glimpse of the Madonna. She stood behind the jagged moor of broken glass, completely unharmed, serene. Her stone eyes seemed to follow me, not with anger, not with condemnation, but with a profound, unshakable stillness that unnerved me more than any divine wrath ever could have. The ride in the police car was silent. The world outside the smeared window was a blur of indifferent lights and shadows. At the station, the air smelled of stale coffee, disinfectant, and quiet desperation. I was processed like any common criminal. My fingerprints were taken, my photograph snapped under a harsh, unflattering light. The man I saw in that photo was a stranger, a tired, frightened old man with wild, haunted eyes. The zealot was gone. I was allowed one phone call. My hands trembled as I dialed the number I knew better than my own name, Layla's. It rang 3 times, each ring a hammer blow against my heart. "Dad?" Her voice was small, laced with a confusion that twisted a knife in my gut. "Layla," I began, but my own voice was a dry rasp, a stranger's voice. "Where are you? I saw something on the news. Some man at the old cathedral." I couldn't speak. The lie died on my tongue. What could I say? "I did it for you? I did it to save you?" The words felt like ash in my mouth. "Dad, was that you?" The silence stretched between us, thick with everything I had broken. "Dad, please tell me that wasn't you." All I could manage was a choked sob, a sound of utter defeat, and then her voice changed. The confusion hardened into something I had never heard from her before, a cold, sharp-edged certainty that cut me to the bone. "They said a man, an older man, did it out of religious hatred. Oh God, it was you." I heard her take a shuddering breath, the sound of a daughter's world collapsing. "Why? Why would you do that? Do you have any idea what you've done to me, to our family? I tried to explain, to summon the old arguments about purity, about protecting our ways, about the poison of this new culture, but they crumbled before they could form. They were just words, hollow and meaningless against the raw, vibrating pain in her voice. "Don't call me again," she said, her voice finally breaking. "Just don't." The line went dead. I stood there, holding the receiver, listening to the monotonous drone of the dial tone, a sound more final than any slammed door. She had hung up on me. My daughter, my Layla, the very reason for my whole life, had cut me off. The cell door slammed shut with a deafening clang of finality. I was alone, utterly, completely alone. The cot was a thin, stained mattress on a cold metal slab. A single bare bulb hummed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the concrete walls. This was my reward. This was the glorious end to my holy war. Not a martyr's crown, but a cold cell and a dead phone line. I sank onto the cot, the full weight of my failure crashing down on me. I had lost everything: my freedom, my reputation, my daughter. In that suffocating silence, I tried to pray. I closed my eyes and recited the verses that had been my shield and my sword for 60 years. I called out to the God I had served with such ferocious, misguided loyalty. I begged for a sign, for a feeling of comfort, for the assurance that my sacrifice had not been in vain. And for the first time in my life, the heavens were silent. There was no answer, no feeling of peace, no righteous warmth. Just the humming of the light bulb and the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. The God of my fathers, the one I thought I was defending, was nowhere to be found. Or perhaps he had been there all along, and I, in my pride and my fury, had simply been unable to hear him. The fear that crept in then was a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of punishment or of man's judgment. It was the terrifying, soul-crushing fear that I had been wrong about everything. That my entire life had been built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was finally irrevocably coming in. If you've ever felt that kind of despair, that feeling of being completely alone in a world you no longer understand, I hope you'll continue this journey with me. This was my lowest point, but it wasn't the end. If you're finding value in this story, please hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss what happened in that darkness. The hours in that cell stretched into an eternity. There is no clock in a place like that, only the slow, agonizing crawl of time, measured by the shifting of shadows and the distant, muffled sounds of a world you no longer belong to. I lay on the cot, my eyes wide open, staring at the grey concrete ceiling. The humming of the single bulb was the only sound, a monotonous drone that wormed its way into my skull. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Not Layla's, not my wife's, but the face of the statue. Unharmed, serene. Her stone eyes looking at me from behind the spiderweb of shattered glass. I saw the screaming woman, the crying child, the cold click of the handcuffs. And then I heard the dial tone. That dead, empty sound that was the final word on my relationship with my daughter. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I had built my life like a fortress, with high walls of righteousness and certainty. And in one afternoon I had taken a hammer to my own foundation. Now I was buried in the rubble. I curled into a ball on the thin mattress, pulling my knees to my chest like a child. The shame was an acid, eating away at what little was left of my pride. I was a good man, a devout man, a father, and I was a monster. I was a fanatic who had terrified innocent people, and in the process had become the one thing I feared most, a source of shame for my family, a pariah. The tears I'd held back for so long finally came. They weren't tears of anger or self-pity, they were tears of utter desolation. A silent, hot flood of grief for the man I had been, the daughter I had lost, and the God who had abandoned me. I must have drifted off into a state that wasn't quite sleep, but a deeper, darker exhaustion. The humming of the light bulb faded away. The cold of the concrete cell receded, and in the total silent blackness behind my eyelids, a light began to grow. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glare of the prison bulb. This was different. It was a soft, warm glow, like the first light of dawn seen through a morning mist. It didn't hurt my eyes, it soothed them. It grew steadily, pushing back the darkness, filling the empty space inside my head, not with light, but with a feeling of presence. There were no words, no booming voice from the heavens, just this profound, silent, and overwhelming sense of being seen, not judged, not condemned, but simply seen. And in that light, images began to form, clearer than any memory. I saw my mother's face the day I left my homeland forever. Her hands were on my cheeks, her eyes wet with tears, but her smile was full of a love so fierce it broke my heart all over again. Then the image shifted. I saw my wife, God rest her soul, on the day Layla was born. She was exhausted, but her face was luminous with a joy so pure it seemed to light up the world. She held our tiny daughter, a small perfect bundle, and looked at me with an expression that said, "Look what we made. Look at this miracle." And then I saw Layla, not as a baby, but as she was just a few weeks ago, laughing with her friends, her head thrown back, her smile so wide and free. And then her face changed. It was her face on the phone. The shock, the disbelief, the shame, the horror. I saw my own hatred reflected in my daughter's eyes, and the sight of it finally completely broke me. The light didn't accuse me, it simply showed me. It showed me all the love that had been poured into my life, the love I had claimed to be protecting, and it showed me how I had twisted that love into a weapon of fear and control. The light held me in my ugliest moment and didn't flinch. It was a mercy so profound, so undeserved, that it felt more painful than any punishment. I was weeping openly now, my body shaking with silent, racking sobs. The fortress was gone, the walls were dust. I was just a man, stripped bare, exposed in the radiance of a love I had spent a lifetime rejecting. I felt a shame so deep it felt like it would tear me apart. But woven through it was this impossible thread of grace. I knew with a certainty that went deeper than reason that I was not alone in that cell. The presence was with me, holding the shattered pieces of my soul. I don't know how long I remained in that state. It could have been minutes or hours. But eventually the light began to fade, not disappearing but receding like a tide going out, leaving behind a profound and unshakable peace on the shores of my ruined heart. The cold of the cell returned. The humming of the bulb reasserted itself, but everything was different. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. I was still a prisoner, still a man who had committed a terrible act, but the crushing despair was gone, replaced by a quiet, humbling sense of purpose. I had to make this right, not to earn my way back, but because I had finally understood. The next morning, the clang of the cell door opening startled me. A woman stood there. She was young, with tired but kind eyes, and she was holding a cheap cardboard file. "Mr. Amir," she asked, her voice gentle. "My name is Sarah. I'm your public defender." She sat across from me at the small metal table. She didn't look at me with disgust or fear. She looked at me like I was a person. As she spoke, explaining the charges, the legal process, my eyes were drawn to a small, simple silver pin on the lapel of her blazer. It was a dove, carrying an olive branch. A symbol of peace. It was a small thing, a coincidence my old self would have sneered. But to me in that moment it was everything. It was a sign, a quiet confirmation that the mercy I had felt in the darkness was real, and that it was now here, in the light of day, in the form of this kind stranger who had come to help. This was the true beginning of my journey back, not just out of a jail cell, but out of the prison I had built for myself. If this part of the story resonated with you, if you've ever felt a moment of grace in your darkest hour, please let me know by hitting the like button. And make sure you've turned on notifications, because the path from that cell was longer and more difficult than I could have ever imagined. The legal process is a slow, grinding machine. I was released on bail, a stranger in my own life, waiting for a trial that felt both a lifetime away and terrifyingly imminent. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like an extension of that cell. The silence was different here. It wasn't the full, peaceful silence I had felt after the light. It was an empty, sterile silence, thick with the ghosts of my failure. Layla's number was a wound in my phone that I was forbidden to touch. I'd see her picture, and my hand would ache with the phantom weight of the hammer. In those first few days of freedom, the old Emir tried to reassert control. He was a stubborn, prideful creature, and he was fighting for his life. He whispered in my ear as I tried to sleep. "It was a dream, you fool, a hallucination brought on by stress and humiliation. You were in a concrete box under a buzzing light for hours after committing a crime. Your mind simply broke. It created a fantasy to protect you from the shame." And for a while, I listened. It was the only logical explanation. The visions of my mother, my wife, they were just memories weaponized by my own guilt. The feeling of a presence, a psychological coping mechanism. The brain is a powerful thing, my old self argued. It can create whole worlds to save itself from pain. I tried to cling to that logic. It was a cold and miserable comfort, but it was familiar. It was the world I understood, a world of cause and effect, of rules and punishment. But the experience wouldn't let me go. It wasn't a memory that faded. It was a seed that had been planted in the barren soil of my soul, and it was beginning to grow. At night I would dream not of the cell, but of the light itself. I would be floating in a warm, silent ocean of pure radiance, and the feeling of being seen, of being known and forgiven, would wash over me with such intensity that I would wake with tears on my cheeks and a profound ache in my chest. During the day, the world seemed to be conspiring against my doubt. I'd be walking down the street, my head bowed in shame, and I'd look up to see a mural on a brick wall, a woman with a serene face holding a child. I'd turn on the television to distract myself, and a nature documentary would be on, the narrator talking about the unexplainable migration of birds, following a map written in the stars. Coincidences, my old self screamed the word. They're just coincidences. You are projecting meaning onto a meaningless world because you are weak and afraid. But the voice was growing weaker. The more I tried to rationalize, the more hollow the explanations sounded, because I couldn't rationalize the peace. The logic of my old life had no explanation for the quiet sense of mercy that had settled in my heart, even amidst the wreckage of my life. The shame was the worst part. It was a constant companion, a shadow that followed me everywhere. It wasn't just shame for what I had done at the cathedral. It was a deeper, more agonizing shame for the man I had been for decades. I remembered Layla, as a teenager, coming home from a friend's house, excited about a charity bake sale their church was holding. I remembered the sneer on my face. "Don't waste your time with their superstitions," I had told her, my voice dripping with contempt. "Their faith is a hollow shell, all songs and cookies to distract them from the truth." I saw the light go out of her eyes. I remembered seeing Pastor Dave in his yard, wearing a simple wooden cross. I had laughed to myself, thinking how pathetic it was to cling to such a crude symbol. I had spent a lifetime mocking their statues, their icons, their saints. I called them idols, crutches for the weak-minded. And now the face of one of those stone idols was the only thing that had ever looked at me, in my most monstrous moment, with anything other than condemnation. The hypocrisy was a physical sickness. I had been so proud, so certain in my righteousness, and it was all a lie. My faith hadn't been strong, it had been brittle. It was an armor of pride, and the moment it was struck, it had shattered into a million pieces. I knew I couldn't go on like this, suspended between the man I was and the man I was terrified I might be becoming. The logical arguments had failed. The shame was eating me alive. I had to do something, I had to face the source of this terrifying, beautiful upheaval in my soul. One afternoon I found myself walking downtown, my feet moving with a will of their own. I didn't go to the old cathedral. I couldn't. The thought of facing that place, of seeing the boards over the broken glass, was more than I could bear. Instead, I found a small, quiet church on a side street, one I must have passed 1,000 times without ever truly seeing. Its heavy oak doors were propped open. For 10 minutes I just stood across the street, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. My old self was screaming at me. "What are you doing? This is the enemy's house. This is a place of falsehood." But another, quieter voice simply whispered, "Go." I took a deep breath and crossed the street. Stepping over the threshold felt like stepping into another world. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, incense, and something else. Stillness. A few people were scattered in the pews, their heads bowed. No one looked at me. No one challenged me. In a small alcove lit by a bank of flickering votive candles, she was there. A different statue, this one carved from wood, smaller, more humble. But her face had the same impossible serenity, the same open hands. I walked toward her, my legs trembling. I didn't kneel, I didn't know how, I just stood there a few feet away looking at the carved wooden face. And in the silent, sacred space of that church, I finally allowed myself to believe. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream, it was grace, and it had been offered to me, the man with the hammer, the destroyer, the fool. The tears that came were not tears of grief or shame, but of a quiet, soul-shattering gratitude. This was a step I never thought I'd take in a million years. If you're following along on this impossible journey, a simple like would mean the world to me, and hitting that notification bell ensures you'll see where this new, uncertain path leads next. Leaving that small church was like being born again into the same broken world. The sun was still in the sky, cars still drove down the street, but I was seeing it all through new eyes. The gratitude in my heart was a fragile, flickering candle, and I knew instinctively that the winds of my old life would try their best to blow it out. And they did. Word travels fast in a tight-knit community, especially a story as strange and shameful as mine. The man who declared war on a statue was now seen haunting the very places he once condemned. The whispers were the first to find me. At the market, I'd feel eyes on my back. I'd hear my name spoken in hushed, urgent tones, followed by words like crazy, broken, shame. Old friends, men I had shared tea with for 20 years, would now cross the street to avoid me. Then came the confrontations. An old acquaintance, a man named Farouk, cornered me outside my apartment building one afternoon. His face, usually so jovial, was a mask of concern and pity. "Amir," he said, his voice low, "we have heard things, that you are confused, that the stress of your crime has broken your mind. People are saying you had a vision. This is a trick, a deception to pull you from the true path when you are at your weakest." The old me, the Amir of just a few weeks ago, would have bristled with rage. He would have argued, quoted scripture, defended his honor with a torrent of furious words. But that man was a ghost. I looked at Farouk, at the genuine worry in his eyes, and I felt no anger, only a quiet sadness. I placed a hand on my heart. "Farouk," I said, my voice steady, "it was not a trick. It was not a dream. It was the most real thing that has ever happened to me." He just shook his head, muttered a prayer for my soul, and walked away. He was not the last. Some accused me of betraying our people, of bringing disgrace upon our community. Others tried to reason with me, offering psychological explanations, telling me it was a textbook case of a guilt-induced hallucination. Each conversation was a small death, a cutting of another tie that had once held my world together. But their doubts couldn't extinguish the candle. If anything, they made me shield it more closely. I found myself walking past Pastor Dave's house more and more often. I'd see the simple wooden cross on his door, a symbol I once despised, and now it felt like a quiet invitation. One Saturday he was in his front yard, wrestling with a string of festive lights for an upcoming church picnic. He saw me hesitating on the sidewalk and waved, a big, uncomplicated gesture. My feet felt like lead, but I made myself walk up his driveway. He didn't ask where I'd been, he didn't mention the news. He just wiped a smear of dirt from his forehead and said, "Amir, good to see you. Could you give me a hand with this?" And just like that, I was helping him untangle the lights. We worked in silence for a few minutes, and then he spoke, his voice gentle. "I heard you've had a difficult time." I just nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Sometimes," he continued, "it takes getting completely lost to find the right road." He invited me to the picnic. My first instinct was to say no. The thought of being in a crowd, of their songs, their symbols, it was terrifying. But the quiet voice that had whispered to me in the church simply said, "Go." The picnic was a sea of unfamiliar faces, the air thick with the smell of barbecue and freshly cut grass. I felt like an intruder, a wolf in a sheep's pasture. But no one looked at me with suspicion. They smiled. They offered me food. A woman handed me a plate with a kindness that almost brought me to my knees. And then Pastor Dave stood up on a small, makeshift stage. After a few announcements, he looked out at the crowd and his eyes found mine. "Friends," he said, "we have a guest with us today who has been on a remarkable journey. Amir, would you be willing to share a few words with us?" A hush fell over the crowd. Every eye turned to me. My heart was that old war drum again, pounding against my ribs. My legs were trembling. I thought I would collapse. But I looked past the faces, and I remembered the light in the cell. I remembered the feeling of being seen and forgiven. I walked to the stage, my hands shaking. I cleared my throat, the microphone amplifying the unsteady sound. "Most of you. You don't know me," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "But some of you do. You know me as the angry man down the street, the man whose face was filled with judgment, the man who hated your joy, your symbols, your faith." I took a deep, shuddering breath. I was the man with the hammer. I went to the old cathedral to destroy something beautiful because I was terrified of it. I was a man so full of my own righteousness, I had no room for God's mercy. I looked out at their faces, and I saw not anger, but a profound, listening stillness. In a cold, dark cell when I'd lost everything, my family, my freedom, my pride, I was shown a mercy I did not deserve. The very thing I had tried to smash, the image of that serene mother, became the vessel for a light that showed me not my sin, but all the love I had rejected in my life. The stone face I wanted to destroy showed me my own human face, and the face of my daughter, and the face of my wife. It didn't condemn me. It welcomed me home. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't wipe them away. I am here to say that I am sorry. I am sorry for the hatred I carried. I am sorry for the fear my actions caused. I am asking for your forgiveness. I paused, my voice breaking. I learned that faith is not a fortress to protect you from the world. It is a bridge to connect you to it. The very thing I rejected, the grace you all speak of so freely, is what found me in the rubble and lifted me from the ground. The transformation of a human heart is the greatest miracle of all. It's not about changing your religion. It's about allowing your heart to be changed. It's about letting mercy tear down the walls of your pride and letting a new kind of faith, a living faith, be built in its place. My story is proof that no one is beyond reach, that no heart is too hard to be softened, no darkness too deep for the light to penetrate. If this story has resonated with the faith in your own heart, if it has touched a place in you that understands brokenness and the hope of renewal, please show your support by liking this video. It helps this message of hope reach others who might be lost in their own darkness. And I truly want to hear from you. In the comments below, please share a moment of unexpected grace in your life. Let's fill this space with our own stories of light. And please subscribe and turn on all notifications so we can continue to walk this path of faith together.